welcome to the Classics podcast Does Virgil's Aeneid with myself, Katrina Kelly.
And me, Caroline Lawrence.
Hello and welcome back to the Classics podcast Does Virgil's Aeneid, the podcast where myself, Katrina Kelly, and best-selling author Caroline Lawrence pick a word from Virgil's epic poem to springboard us into his ancient world and explore the themes, characters, structure, imagery, and sounds of one of the greatest poems of all time. I hope you enjoyed our last episode where we talked about Cano, I Sing, and we learnt more about Virgil himself, his life, his works, and about those opening lines of the Aeneid in Book One. We also talked more about the character arc and ways of storytelling, and in this episode we're going to do a little bit more on Cano because we want to come to the singing part of that verb. And then we're going to have our word for the day, which is, Caroline?
Our word for the day is Musa.
Musa.
You say Musa, and I say Musa. Isn't this amazing the way we don't really know how words work?
I know, and I don't think it's an accent thing either. I think it is a sense that the Latin we're not entirely sure about and we can pronounce in different ways.
And it's allowed, isn't it?
It is allowed. We say it's allowed. And we love to hear people speaking Latin and practicing, and again, not being worried about perfect pronunciation because there would have been so many different pronunciations and accents too.
Absolutely. And now, before we talk about the muse, though, you had a few fascinating things to say about Kano, didn't you?
Yes, I wanted to come back to the singing part of that verb. And singing was very important in the world of heroes. So think of the bards in the Odyssey. If you've read the Odyssey, we've got Phemius at Ithaca. We've got Demodocus at the Phaeacian palace. Was he a stand-in for Homer? Again, the blind bard. And they can move Odysseus to tears with their song. So they obviously have a great influence in the poem on the characters themselves. And Odysseus himself, wily Odysseus, who has always had a way with words, that's his epithet, isn't it? In the Iliad as well. He sings and he uses his words to persuade and even deceive, as we hear in the Aeneid. He does that in Book Two, according to Aeneas. So these performers in the poems allow Homer and Virgil to tell us alternative narratives. It's a different voice. But they also reveal, I think, the cultural significance of these singers. So they were real, they were people who would bring entertainment, they'd bring news, as well as an art form to a group, whether that's in a royal palace or that's outside in a gathering of people, whether that's on the road or at an event. So somebody who can canera, as we said, the verb to sing, is respected, and sometimes they're even spared, like Phemius when the suitors have their time and then Odysseus comes back to Ithaca, they spare the bard because it's almost as if they're precious goods, they're people that have a real gift. So in the Aeneid, Aeneas gets his own turn to recount his adventures, just as Odysseus does for the Phaeacians, and that, of course, is books two and three. This is at Dido's palace, and in plot terms, it's interesting because this is part of when she's falling in love with him, right? She's been encouraged by Juno and by Cupid to fall in love, but it's really listening to Aeneas showcase his singing talent, but also his way with words and his story that is part of her falling in love. So it is heroic. Heroes can be singers. It's not something that we might think about other societies where, well, if you're a singer, then you're not a warrior. But actually, it's literally another string to their bow. But not for too long. I think that's also part of this epic world. There's an interesting scene in the Iliad in Book 9 when Achilles sings, then this embassy approach him to beg him to return to the battlefield. He sings of the Cleia Androne, that's the glories of men in Greek. This is why heroes fight. They're fighting to win glory that will be forever immortalized. And the only way that that can be, they don't have movies, is that it's from bards singing of their deeds. Again, think back to that opening line we talked about last week, Arma virumque cano, to sing of weapons, of battles, and of men, of their deeds. men are nothing, they aren't heroes if nobody talks about them. So when Achilles isn't fighting but he's singing, that's partly an act of defiance. His time, his honour, has been spoiled by Agamemnon. But it's also this paradoxical reminder that he's going to have to return to fight, or else no one's going to sing of him. There's no point in him singing if he's not a fighter. He needs his time to shine, his time to gain that glory that will be sung about.
Yeah, so how does Virgil play with that? Does he have any examples of that in the Aeneid?
He does. And I think in order to find out, we have to also consider some of the scholarship behind this because we have some really influential people, including Milman Parry and Albert Lord as well. And this is his seminal work, The Singer of Tales, which was a fascinating piece of research because he studied modern day Serbo-Croat poets who primarily use oral formulae to remember long passages. And so rather than having making everything up on the spot or memorizing one written down text, what actually they and then the Homeric poets before them were also composing as they went along. They're composing orally, but
Mm.
using these blocks, these kind of formula that they're used to using. And that's all very meta, I think, to think of the poets singing of poets because they are singing of bards like themselves. But both of them are reworking familiar tales and then adding in new elements to excite and cause wonder. And that's what we get in both the Homeric poems and in the Aeneid as well, that songs are something that produce emotion and cause wonder.
Yes, I agree totally. The songs, the stories, it's like Netflix, isn't it? We want our entertainment, we want our stories. And just as you were talking about the hero playing music, um, and how we don't often think of a strong hero being a musician, but if you think of heavy metal and the guitarists on their electric guitars, they're very masculine, aren't they?
Totally, and loads of other films that I'm sure we can think of as well. Please think of your own examples where we have people falling in love and it's music. One of the parties is a musician, or that's something that really brings out their character and makes people fall in love with them or think of them in a really positive light.
Yeah, the one different there's a big difference though is your bards, the ones that Milman Parry studied, and the people who remembered long tracks, and they compose as they sing. But they were itinerant. They were living, wandering around, and composing as they went here and there. But Virgil surely was in one place. I imagine him in his garden, his inner garden, pacing back and forth, saying things out loud, doing the lines out loud, reading them. And then, okay, he got it. So he rushes into his tablinum, his study, and he makes a few marks on his wax tablet. And he goes over and over a few lines per day. We know he works so slowly. And then he'll finally, in fact, I don't know if we mentioned this before, but Servius, his one of the commentators on Virgil, who lived in the fourth century, he talks about Virgil taking a day to write 2 lines and being like a mother bear licking her cubs into shape. And in fact, that's an expression Virgil himself uses. So he's one man, not doing it kind of like a stand-up comedian,
Mm.
having to think fast on his feet. He's like me in my room writing things down.
Exactly, but that means he can really, it's more studied, isn't it? It's more thought about in such depth that he can then really bring in references. But as you say, they're not as meta as they were when the bards are talking and singing of the bards are like themselves. But that doesn't mean that Virgil doesn't include bards, and he still has them there, partly to reflect the epic world that he's writing about, and partly to reflect these antecedents, the Homers and like. So it's not like Demodocus and Homer, but he still has them. So, book one, we have Iopas, who's a Phoenician bard who sings, interestingly, not of heroic deeds when we've got this setting in Carthage, but of the stars, the sun, and the moon. And astronomy was a subject associated with the Carthaginians. So, again, for the Roman reader, then that might be something that's just helping set the scene for them, putting them in the ancient epic world, but also a place, something that they can relate to in their modern world. And it also we have Iapas. He only appears really briefly in book one. There's a couple of lines to say,
Yeah, because I
in the
never
meantime,
heard of
he sang.
him.
Yeah, in the meantime, he sang a song. We don't get any of that song. We don't get a sense of what it did, except that we do have this sense of wonder, and it whets Dido's appetite because she then says, "Hey, Aeneas, do you want to tell us a story?" So it's setting up then Aeneas being the bard, being the person to tell the tale, and we then get him, as we say, doing books two and three. But he's not necessarily the most reliable narrator, and we are seeing it very much from his eyes.
Oh, but we all like an unreliable narrator, don't we?
Yeah, we
Or
do, we
maybe
do.
someone who spins it to his advantage, yeah?
For sure. So the next actual person whose profession, I suppose, is to be a singer and a performer, doesn't come until book nine. We have Cretheus, who again, not somebody that we might know from the Aeneid, not a famous character. But Cretheus brings us our most striking repetition of that phrase that we've been talking about the last few weeks, arma virumque cano. So we have a bit from line 774 to 777 of book nine, and it goes like this. Amicum creitha musis, creitha musarum comitem cui carmina semper, et Cythaerae cordi numerosque intendere nervis, semper quos atque arma vivum pugnasque canebat.
Oh, and I had a look at this, and it's actually slightly tricky to translate. It's one of those Virgil might have gone over again. But again, as I said, I think in an earlier session, Llewellyn Morgan notes that even the Romans might have found his his denseness of his poetry translating. So it goes like this: Friend to the Muses, Cretheus. Cretheus, companion of the Muses. There's a little chiastic structure there. Cretheus, companion of the Muses, whose songs and chords of his Cythera stroked meters on the strings. So yes, it's so he was always singing of horses and arms, men and battles. So there we've got that arma virum, don't we? Arma
Mhm.
virum pugnasque canebat.
Yeah, so very close to that opening line. Slightly different tense as well with the Knabat and imperfect tense there, but really reminding us all the way back to the beginning. You've got some really beautiful sounds, qui carmina semper cithara corde, all those k sounds capturing the chords of the cithara and the musicality of it.
Oh, and numeros intendere nervis. The strings, nerve is a string, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really beautiful image, but it comes in a moment of battle and war. So Cretheus, who's singing in a way his own version of the Aeneid of horses and arms, men and battles, is killed by Turnus, so one of Aeneas's main opponents, at a point when Aeneas is away from the battle seeking advice from Evander. So I think we definitely have a bit of a parallel here to Achilles and that embassy, away from a moment of war, when our hero's not fighting, something goes wrong. This is perhaps a word of warning from Virgil that Turnus can't be the hero to survive instead of Aeneas because he's sort of stifling the culture that Augustus is seeking to support.
Oh, I
That
like
that would
that.
be my argument at least. I think this is Virgil saying music is important, song is important. Even in this time of war, we have somebody representing that, but he's been slain by the bad guy. So there's a bit of a small death to the ancient world of heroes at this point, I think, too, and their glorious deeds. As we say, once the poet's dead, then no one can sing of
Yeah.
heroes. So what are heroes at all?
So the moral is don't kill the storyteller.
Exactly.
Do we just wondering, do we think that we know that when the ancient Greek bards were reciting, there was often music, wasn't there? They'd stroke a lyre or something, or there maybe be a little cymbal or little somebody playing drums in the background. Do we think? I have no idea. This just came to. Do we think that in Virgil's time he didn't sing? Surely there wasn't a tune like there were in many of the Greek tragedies. Some of the choruses are set to tunes, weren't they? Was there any music, do we think? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it feels like there must have been because we know that music was such an important part of Roman society and something, again, to learn and be skilled at. We have so much archaeological evidence and paintings and frescoes of lyres and, things being depicted. But it is still very hard to imagine what that would have sounded like and whether this poetry isn't being accompanied by music in the same way that it was in the epic ancient world. There's
Mm.
been fabulous work on reconstructing the sounds of ancient music, and again, we can put some links in the show notes to some of that, especially on the Greek side. But have you heard anything on the Roman side, Caroline?
Well, yeah. Well, Armand Dangour is great on the Greek side, and I was just looking the other day on YouTube and found someone's put the beginning of the first few lines of the Aeneid to a kind of song. So maybe we can put a link to that. It's quite fun to listen to.
Yeah.
Um, but the melody's quite repetitious. It's not earworm in a good sense.
That is the thing, though, when you do, and it's amazing how they've reconstructed Greek music from the notation and the poetry, bringing that really accurately. But it's not a sound that we maybe would enjoy listening to ourselves. I think tastes have changed somewhat over the millennia, and it really is, it's an unusual sound, let's say.
It's an unusual. I just have to say a quick aside that having listened to what they think ancient Greco-Roman music sounded like, there's a film, an old film called Quo Vadis with Peter Ustinov as
Mm.
Nero, and I don't know where they got the idea for the song he sings as Rome burns, but it's pretty darn close to what they're assuming for ancient Greek and Roman times. So kudos to whoever composed that song, and just go on YouTube and do Peter Ustinov as Nero and Quo Vadis singing his song, "Oh Age Divine" or something. He's so good. But anyway, we've been talking a lot about singing, but in line 8, Virgil finally gets to the muse, not to tell him to not to sing through him, but to remind him, um, as if he knew it all along. And shall we read that little bit?
Yes, let's go. We're going back to book one, and we're reminding ourselves of that first invocation to the Muses before we then dive a little bit more into who these Muses actually were.
Who are the muses? Do you know, I tried to memorize them once. I should know them. I've got them. Luckily, I put them in my book Pantheon, which I wrote recently. So, who were the muses? Well, the mother of the muses is Mnemosyne, whose name means memory. And because poets need a prodigious memory as well as inspiration. So she's one of the Titans. And according to Hesiod, she's the mother of the muses, who were, are we ready? 9 of them. Clio, whose name means glory, the muse of history. Euterpe, whose name means giving delight, the muse of elegiac poetry. Thalia, abundance, the muse of comedy and pastoral poetry, often holds a comic mask. Melpomene, which just means singer, I think, muse of tragedy, she often holds a tragic mask. Terpsichore, the muse of dance. Erato comes from the word eros, so the muse of love poetry, erotic poetry. Polyhymnia, many praises is the meaning of that, and she's the muse of songs for kind of religious rites and rituals. Urania, of the heavens, as you said, the heavens were very important to them, I think, for the gods and for the afterlife and stuff like that. And finally, and probably most important, Calliope. Her name means beautifully voiced. Opes is mouth, voice, face, beautiful face, mouth, voice. And she's the muse of epic poetry. So she's the one Virgil should be calling on. So presumably that's who he's referring to.
Yeah, because in book one, these lines, Musa mihi causas memora, quae numine laeso, etc. He doesn't tell, it's just Musa, right? He doesn't say Calliope, does he, or any of the others. So we don't have that sense exactly of who he's referring to. It's one of the, or the sort of all the muses put together in
Yeah,
one. But
maybe he's covering his bases.
he does call on Calliope later, though, doesn't he?
Well, actually, I thought he did, and then I looked it up, and I don't think she's named anywhere. Um, does he call on any of the muses by name? I think you know he does,
I
doesn't he?
think I think we find he does call on Erato, which is interesting. That muse of love poetry, as you said, but not in the place that we would expect. Not necessarily in the Dido book, but a little bit later on.
And so before we look at that, I came across an amazing mosaic of Virgil um, from the second or third century AD, and it's from Hadramitum, which is strangely in Tunisia, about 100 miles as the crow flies south of Carthage, 150 if you use kilometers. And it shows Virgil writing on a scroll, and you can actually read if you turn it upside down, Musa mihi causas memora, and he's flanked by two muses, neither of whom are either Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, or Erato, the muse of erotic poetry, but um, Clio, the muse of history, we can tell that by her little attribute, and also um, Melpomene, the muse of tragedy. And this is so fascinating because Clio, the muse of history, is holding her scroll, and Melpomene is holding the tragic mask.
Mhm.
So this is really interesting.
Yeah, so is that saying then that people a little bit later on, a couple of hundred years later, reading Virgil have gotten an inheritance of the Aeneid, however that's been perceived for that amount of time, are seeing it as actually almost a quasi-historical document, that this is very much about Rome's history, and it's also a tragic tale. Maybe that does refer to the Dido part, maybe that is referring more to Aeneas's troubles throughout the whole thing, but it's not what we would expect, as you say, epic altogether.
Exactly, and as we've been, we're it's being revealed to us almost as we're doing this that it's a tragic story, isn't it? On both the the only place it's not tragic is that he does found Rome, but almost everything else is tragic about it. And there is actually a bit I just came across looking for the name Calliope. Is it anywhere in there? I couldn't find it, but he does in Aeneid 10. He says, Pandite nunc helicona dei cantus movete. Now open helicon, goddesses, and inspire song. So again, he's calling on the dei, the goddesses, the way that Homer says Thea, main and Aedes Thea, calls
Mhm.
on the generic goddess of the meat. So so maybe again he's covering his bases. He's calling on them all. So maybe it's fine that we've got the muse of history and the muse of a tragedy on that mosaic. But one thing about when I think of a muse, I always think of like the muse is kind of something from outside who flows through you and kind of inhabits you. And we've heard artists, songwriters often say, it was like, I don't know, something just took me over and I wrote it. Um, but, but, but Virgil calls on the muse to help him remember. And remember, the mother of the muses was,
Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, right?
yeah. So it wasn't just inspiration that comes from nothing. You've got to have the memory there and you've got to access it in your brain, don't you? And memory's so important to the ancients. They came up with the idea of because they had, not everyone could read or write, they had prodigious feats of memory. And I mean, it's said that Caesar knew the name of every man in his army, which is extraordinary. And there are other feats of memory. There's one guy who could recite the entire Aeneid. Or the Iliad maybe. That's not extraordinary. That might have been your curriculum, but backwards.
Okay, that is impressive.
And so the Romans, they also came up with this whole idea of the Roman room, where you go through a room in your mind, and each object in the room, as you go in through the atrium, and you see the impluvium and the compluvium and the little lararium and things, you link an item with that, and it helps you memory. And I used to teach when I was transitioning from being a teacher of primary school kids to a writer of books for primary school kids. I taught memory techniques, and I was fascinated by things like mind maps, and especially using the creative daydreaming right brain, which governs color, the senses, music, spatial skills, with the logical left brain, which is good with numbers and lists and structures. And of course, both sides are creative, but when you put them together, um, it's really creative, and it helps cement and inspire you. And When I did a Latin course, a summer school for some primary school kids, and I'm trying to give them little mnemonics to help them remember words. And for cano, for sing, I said, imagine a singing can. But actually, when we did canary, I thought a singing canary is even better. And so, one thing Virgil does is he has some amazing imagery, striking imagery, and that might be something fun we can look out for as we read more into the poem.
And I love that idea of the Roman room. It reminds me of Sherlock Holmes and his memory palace. And that was
Exactly, that's where he got it from. Yeah, yeah.
fantastic. So I think we're going to come back to that other reference to a muse that we do have in the Aeneid, which is in book seven. So we've spoken briefly before about how Virgil almost restarts the narrative. It's the second half of the Aeneid. In book seven, we've had this moment where Aeneas has left the underworld. We've got that slightly unsettling, uncertain which gate did he exit through, but now he's done his one of his main tasks. So thinking back to that character arc, and he's been through the threshold of the underworld. He's come through a journey of knowledge and understanding. He's grasped the golden bough. He's also been guided by his father. He's seen the parade of heroes. He's seen Dido and his dad and other people that he needs to talk to and learn from. So it's been this kind of a real sense of journey. He now comes out from the other side of that. Virgil starts book seven. He actually doesn't again start in the place we'd expect. He starts straight away by saying something else a bit sad. He talks about Aeneas's nurse, Caieta, who has who has died, and he now Aeneas has to perform some funeral rites. Again, showing the piety of his character, though, and this sense of duty and honor. He's doing the things that he is being expected to do before he can continue on his journey. It's another point, isn't it, that he has to cross, another task to be achieved.
Would you even call it a threshold?
That's the word I was waiting for. And we then get another sense of reset in his description. We have one of those, talking of epithets and oral poetry. In Homer, you always get rosy-fingered dawn. We have this sense of aurora rising, it's a new day, it's a new start, and Aeneas is now setting off. He's sighting, he's now reaching Latium, he's coming towards the Tiber. In a way, this could be the end of the story, couldn't it? This could be, he's done his big
Yeah.
adventure, he's achieved his goals, and he's got there. He's landed. Fantastic. But we're only halfway through. This is not the end.
So
But
this would be the end of season one of the Netflix TV series, and then we've got to have season two, don't we?
exactly, although I'm sure there'd be a cliffhanger, so there'd be something that's going
Mm.
to leave us wanting more for season two.
And of course, it's the end of the basically Odyssey bit, and the start. It's going to be the start, isn't it, of the Iliad bit? Yeah.
Exactly, which doesn't bode well. We know that there's dark times ahead. But as he comes, so in line 37, 38, thereabouts of this book seven, now we get Virgil doing his big invocation to the Muses. Okay, it's a reset, more epic poetry. Here we go. Except it's not to Calliope. It's to Nunc age crereges Erato, quae tempora rerum quis latio antiquo furet status ad vena classem, cum primum alcionis exercitus appulit oris, expediam et primae revocabo exordia pugnae. Should we do a Dryden translation again? We've been doing quite a bit of Dryden recently. I think, would you like to give it
Yeah,
to us now?
yeah. I would like to do that. Yes. So now, Erato, thy poet's mind inspire, and fill his soul with thy celestial fire. Relate what Latium was, her ancient kings, declare the past and state of things, when first the Trojan fleet Ausonia sought, and how the rivals loved, and how they fought.
Brilliant.
Ooh, interesting. I
Mm.
don't see any word love down in up there in the Latin. That's a little thing that I think Dryden's added because of the presence of Erato.
Interesting.
But that's great because, as we're going to see soon, that the opponents often love as well as fight. So
So this is a great way of setting out what's to come in this book and for the books to follow. But why is Erato there? This doesn't really fit. We've had our Dido scene. We've why is this a love story? Well, actually, this might take us back yet again to Apollonius of the Bronze Basin fame from our first episode. Um, the scholar R.D. Williams likes to explain it in this way that not only is this something that Apollonius did, and he mentions Erato, he invocates the muse in this way, but that the whole conflict about to be described in the books to come arises from Turnus's refusal to give up his bride Lavinia to the Trojan stranger. So yes, this is a story again, an arma virumque. It's going to be a battle about a man, two men in this case, fighting over a woman. It's another love triangle. And that's why the muse to love is going to be invoked, because that, rather than it being necessarily Juno's anger or again these ways of piety versus rage, it's about people and the things that they love. And in that epic way of thinking about possessions and honor and the time that Achilles is worried about in the Iliad, then Turnus doesn't want his bride to be taken away from him.
Ah, so that last line in the Dryden translation, how the rivals loved and how they fought, is kind of Lavinia's the object of love, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Although with Virgil, it can have multivalent meanings, can't it?
Exactly. It could be the place you love, i.e., the Latins' home of Latium that they don't want. Understandably, there's Trojan stranger coming along and taking it over, claiming it as his own, and forming a new race of people.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. That's something I've never thought about. Thanks so much for that insight. And I think it prepares us nicely for next week when we finally get to one of the most popular books, which is going to be book four, the story of Dido and Aeneas.
Exactly. Passion can be devout and destructive, and it does drive the narrative. So we are very much looking forward to coming back to talk about their story. And shall we reveal the word that's going to give
Yes,
us
because just
our
before
insight?
we reveal the word, what do you, the listeners, think the word we've chosen to sum up book four is? Should we say it together?
We'll say it together.
Our word will be.
Thank you so much for joining us. Please
Thank
come
you.
back for more. We shall see you next time when we turn to the story of Dido and Aeneas.